everybody, welcome to More Chainsaws Needed, where, because I love horror, thrillers and suspense, I am going to talk, rant, rave about, review and recommend movies, TV series and books in those genres for you guys as I draw and argue with my cat. Yes, hey. First of all, I am sorry this video is coming in March rather than in January. This is because, unfortunately, my start of 2023 was in bed sick. Not a C virus, thankfully, just a bacterial thingy, and I am okay now. And so, well, everything had to be slowed down. Yes, hey, you were a very good nurse. I still hope to hit 11 videos this year for each series, but the original plan of 12 is not going to be doable, as I also don't want to burn out myself. Hope you all understand. As part of my New Year's resolution, I decided that this year, yes, hey, let me finish. I would go in a different direction by not so much focusing on movies, in particular recent movies, and instead I would go back to the classics of horror and more specifically the original Rockstar ghouls, the Universal Classic Monsters, aka the original cinematic universe. Because while the original movies were completely unconnected, because of the popularity and the fact that they were owned by the same studio, they started getting put together in merchandise and in some comedy horror movies, and thus they became the original boy band of nightmares. I'm talking about Dracula, Frankenstein, the creature from the Black Lagoon, the Mummy, and the Wolfman. Dr. Miracle from the Murders in the Rue Morgue is not included, same thing that happens with Dr. Moreau from the Island of Lost Souls, the first adaptation of the Island of Dr. Moreau, despite both movies always being included in sets labeled as Universal Classic Monsters. There are other adaptations of Poe stories included in the DVDs too, but when we talk about monsters, well, it's always the big bad five. And since Dracula is the very first monster of the group, with his debut movie coming in 1931, let's talk a little bit about him. Not about the original film with Bela Lugosi, because unfortunately I haven't been able to get a copy, but I will, but about another famous film with the same name, which also happened to add a completely unnecessary romantic plot and tried hard to erase the subtext present in the original text, despite being titled Bram Stoker's Dracula. One would think that Dracula needs no introduction, right? After all, he's the most famous vampire in history, and since the novel is in the public domain, it has been adapted to more than 30 different films. And the Count himself has also been subject to a lot of cameos in everything from other horror stories to at least 3 appearances in Scooby-Doo. But precisely because everyone and their dog, literally, have had their own versions of Dracula, the original Count has been, well, if not forgotten, at least overshadowed by the more modern version of his story. So let's talk first about the original novel and how Dracula was described there. Dracula was written by Bram Stoker in 1890 and published in 1897 in the form of an epistolary novel. That is to say, it's not a straight narrative, but the story is formed through letters among the main characters, their diary entries, both men and women, as that was quite common in the 1890s, and the occasional newspaper article. Through this method, Stoker relates the story of how solicitor, aka attorney, Jonathan Harker goes to Transylvania in order to help Count Dracula, an old nobleman, to buy a house near London, and then discovers that the Count isn't human, but a vampire, a creature that feeds on human blood and wants to leave his native Transylvania in order to get better hunting grounds. This is very important to note. Dracula's motives are purely about feeding. There is no conquer the world, make an army of vampires, and more importantly for today's subject, no looking for my beloved's reincarnation. No. What Dracula wants is fresh hunting grounds where he can feed himself and probably his wives, given that they don't travel with him originally. That's it. Yes, he was incredibly seductive to people who would be his victims, but that was more for hunting than for actual interest in the individual. His real reason to move to London was simple. Transylvanians were wise to his tricks now, and so feeding was quite difficult. He was just a predator moving on to a better territory. Unfortunately for this apex predator, he happened to choose the one solicitor who was engaged to the best friend of Dracula's first London victim, who also happened to be engaged to a student of an actual vampire scholar. Talk about contrived coincidences. So basically, the second he put his sights on Lucy Westerna, the Count was dead, as he put a target on himself because everyone who loved Lucy and her friend Mina were out for his blood. I am going to explain that, hey. So yes, Dracula is the story of a parasite, in more ways than one, who is hunted by humans who want to eradicate that threat. That's it! So what happened to make this Count, who in the original novel at times is awkward in how he tries to mimic humanity, into a suave and seductive man, and the vampire itself into a romantic figure rather than a human-shaped leech? Personally, I blame Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee. I mean, while their Dracula were still 100% villains with no redemptive qualities, they were still incredibly handsome, elegant, and of course seductive, because a vampire who can't seduce their victim to bite them is a vampire who is not worth its fangs. And of course, after that came other vampires, other stories like Say and Rises, who made the vampires even more seductive and romantic, and well, that's the pipeline who got us Edward Cullen. Let's not talk about him, and go back to Dracula. In particular, good old Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula. From the very first official movie adaptation of Dracula, way back in 1932, and yes, I am being specific because before the movies were the theater plays and Nosferatu, there were small changes to the text of the novel. From mixing three characters together, usually Arthur Holmwood, Dr. Seward, and Quincy Morris tend to be these, with Harker sometimes just to have a smaller cast, to changing the relationship of Dracula to the three vampire women who live in his home, to making Van Helsing an actual vampire hunter from the get-go, a lot of things that are considered common knowledge about the Count come from the movies rather than the novels. A good example are the three women we know as the brides of Dracula. The idea that they are his harem in some way or another is so ingrained in pop culture that everyone knows them as that, the brides of Dracula, without any individual name. However, in the novel they are never called that. Jonathan Harker mentions that two of them have some resemblance to Dracula, which has led to some to believe that in fact one of them is Dracula's wife, while the other two are his daughters, but there is nothing in the novel that confirms it. The idea of Dracula as a married man, however, stuck, and while some adaptations end up removing two brides because vampirism is one thing, but polyamory is a step too far, the brides are now forever known as that. Which brings us, of course, to the main change that Bram Stoker's Dracula brought to us, even if it was not the first movie to flirt with the idea. After years of Dracula as an evil, unrepentant monster who wants to conquer the world, a change brought once again by the movies, Francis Ford Coppola decided that his most close adaptation to the original work needed to redeem Dracula and make him one more of the romantic heroic vampires that are now so common in literature and movies. And here we go first with how Bram Stoker's Dracula was originally promoted as the closest adaptation to the book, which is why Bram Stoker's name is so prominent in the title. Ford Coppola, who had just finished The Godfather Part 3, was famous for being quite faithful to the original material, so people actually believe that it will be a close adaptation to the original book. Unfortunately, just the opening scene proved us wrong, as the movie begins with the origin of Dracula as a vampire, definitely connecting him to Vlad Tepes, the Impaler, when in the book is only implied that he was Vlad Tepes, not confirmed, and making him into a vampire for hating God, as his wife Elisabetta will not enter heaven as she committed suicide due to believing that he was dead. And with that addition, Bram Stoker's Dracula begins one of the most controversial romantic plot tumors of all movie history, the romance between Mina Harker and Dracula, as she is now the reincarnation of Elisabetta Dracula. And this changes everything about the story, because now Dracula is pursuing Mina for a specific reason, and not only that, centers the whole thing in the importance of heterosexual love and manages to change Mina's character completely as she goes from a faithful and loving wife to Jonathan, and also who happens to hold the lone brain cell of the vampire hunter team, but that's another story, to a sexually repressed woman who is willing to cheat on her husband because a vampire is cute. I mean, alluring. Oh yes, I did mention the heterosexual thing because here's the thing. The Dracula novel is incredibly gay. Okay, I should correct myself. Dracula is not just gay. Dracula is sexual, incredibly sexual for the time it was written. There's a reason why vampires are seen as a metaphor to repressed sexuality, and while they didn't become the seductive creatures of the night that they are nowadays until much later, the old Count and his wives were still a good example of how Victorians saw sex, and more importantly, sexual desire to all genders. It's not just the obvious allure of the wives, and later vampire Lucy, to all men who come into their path, but it's also how Dracula treats Jonathan, specifically claiming him as his to the wives when they try to feed from him, in a way that leaves no room for imagination as they got to their knees in front of Jonathan, which I hope is not something I need to explain to you all, because if I do, you are too young to be listening to this video. While the most tense scene of them in the castle, when Jonathan cuts himself while shaving, can be explained away by Dracula's hunger for blood, it's also important to point out that Stoker didn't need to portray Dracula's hunger with the vampire watching Jonathan shave in the bathroom in the first place. The fact that Dracula watches Jonathan at all times, including showering and grooming himself, is going to be later repeated with how he acts around Lucy, his first England victim, and I think that is one of the biggest points that yes, Dracula is bisexual, at least in the book. Then let's talk about Lucy, who in the movie is a lot more flirty and daring than in the book, but at the same time is far more traditional. See, Lucy is wooed by three men: Quincy Morris, an American cowboy that is described in such a way that you know that Stoker had a thing for cowboys, despite knowing nothing about them; Arthur Holmwood, a rich British man who of course is the most proper of the trio and the one who finally wins her hand despite her dying before the wedding; and Dr. Jack Seward, who is, well, a doctor. That's all his interesting points. But the thing is that in the novel, Lucy expresses more than once to Mina in letters that she wished that she could just marry the three without having to choose. And later, after she gets a blood transfusion from each of them when Van Helsing is trying to save her from Dracula, the idea that she is, in fact, married to the three due to this is brought up. Because, besides being gay, the book is also into polyamory, and I can just see the Victorian readers eating this just like modern readers were eating 50 Shades of Grey and reaching for the smelling salts not to faint at the proposal. In a way, Lucy is our proto-first girl, and Mina our proto-final girl, by the way. The one who wanted to be wooed, because of course she wouldn't have sex before marriage, is the first to die, and the one who waits until marriage survives. But this is a conversation for a different day. What is true is that Francis Ford Coppola also did Mina dirty, making her an adulteress who openly wants Dracula's attention, given that in the novel there is a lot of emphasis on Mina's and Jonathan's love and how it is the only thing that actually saves Mina from vampirism. Finally, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Bram Stoker himself was either gay or bisexual, and we know this given his relationship with his boss, actor Henry Irving, whose Faust and Macbeth were inspirations for Dracula, and his very intense letters to both Hal Caine and Walt Whitman. However, he also lived through the Oscar Wilde's trial for homosexuality, and this impacted Stoker greatly, as they were friends, and thus it's quite understandable that years later, when he wrote Dracula, he'd write a lot about suppressed desires. Dracula is a great epistolary novel. At times it may be a little slow for modern readers, but it's a very good gothic story of a blood-sucking monster that should remain a blood-sucking monster. While the vampire as a romantic figure also works, because if it didn't, we wouldn't have the Vampire Chronicles or Twilight or, well, even Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Dracula himself really doesn't work as much with a romantic plot tumor. There are already two romantic subplots in the original story: Lucy and her three suitors, whose love ends tragically, and Jonathan and Mina's, whose love ended up saving Mina, and which was so strong that Jonathan at some points thinks to himself that if Mina becomes a vampire, he'd become a vampire too to be with her. So adding extra romance, in particular heterosexual romance, seems a bit like an overkill. Now, give me a Dracula adaptation where Jonathan is the reincarnation of Dracula's old love, I might get behind that one, if only for variation's sake. Let's see what they do with Renfield, who is also completely different from how he is in the novel in every single movie, but that's a story for another video. I want to thank my dear patrons, Mitch Hyman, Elaine Ho, Jessica, and Ellie Riley, as well as my first supporter, Tanya Pineda, and the most amazing Amy Song, without whom none of these videos would be possible. I also want to remind you that if you want to support these and my other projects and get your name mentioned here, you can do so at patreon.com/Adalisa, written link on description, as I know my name can be hard to spell. And with just $1 a month, you will always be thanked in my videos, as well as get access to a ton of art before anyone else and get the chance to suggest future subjects for videos soon. You can also support me through Ko-fi, and for each coffee, you will get mentioned in 3 future videos. If you can't support me this way, I also accept likes, subscriptions to the channel, and of course, you sharing the links. I will also welcome all your questions, feedbacks, and suggestions in the comments below. This was Adalisa Zarate, and remember, there is not a problem in the horror genre that can't be solved with more chainsaws and a cup of good coffee.